Hello, everyone, and welcome to UBC School of Public Policy and Global Affairs event, Can We Cut Emissions Fast Enough? With the incredible UN Assistant Secretary General and UN Environment Program Executive Director, Joyce Msuya. My name is Samira Hosseina, second-year master's student with the School of Public Policy, and I'm honored to be moderating this event for you today. I would most importantly like to acknowledge that both my residence and the UBC's Point Grey campus are located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and I thank them for this opportunity. I hope you're all excited as I am to hear about how we can address climate change together. To get us going on this journey will be UBC School of Public Policy and Global Affairs Director, Dr. Alison McFarlane. Dr. McFarlane has dedicated her professional and academic career around environment and energy policy. Like any great leader, Professor McFarlane has knowledge that expands a wide range of critical topics. But if there's anyone that you can bet on knowing a great deal on nuclear energy, that you can bet on knowing is nuclear energy policy, that would be Dr. McFarlane. Her expertise on issues associated with nuclear energy range from security and regulation to safety and nuclear waste disposal. Her experience combined in science and technology won former President Barack Obama's full confidence in her as he nominated Dr. McFarlane to chair the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 2012, making her one out of only 3 women to have been selected in this important role so far. She is an author and a leader, and someone I look up to for inspiration in my career as a future policy professional. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Alison McFarlane.
Thanks so much, Samira. Thanks for that kind introduction. That was really nice. Welcome everyone today to our webinar, co-hosted by the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and the Political Science Department here at UBC. We're particularly excited to host this event as one of the key policy issues that we address in our research and teaching in SPPGA is the global climate change crisis, of course. I first want to acknowledge that this event emerged from connections made by political science professor Yves Tiberghien, a faculty associate of our school and former co-director of our Master in Public Policy and Global Affairs program. Yves had been teaching a course on global political economy and learned that Joyce's daughter, Melanie Mpanju, was a student. Melanie's joining us today. Because of the types of topics they covered in class, Melanie proposed to have her mother speak in an event. That was nice, Melanie, to volunteer your mother. Melanie, who's graduated just last week, congratulations, Melanie, from UBC with a political science degree, will be providing closing remarks at today's event. I also want to acknowledge that Professor David Boyd has joined our virtual audience today. Dr. Boyd is jointly appointed with SPPGA and the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability at UBC and is currently a UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Joyce Msuya, Assistant Secretary General with the United Nations and Deputy Executive Director with the UN Environment Program. Between November 2018 and June 2019, Ms. Msuya served as Interim Executive Director overseeing UNEP's portfolio in 33 countries and administering 9 multilateral environment agreements on critical environmental issues. Ms. Msuya has more than 20 years of extensive experience in international development strategy, operations, knowledge management, and partnerships across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Prior to her role with UNEP, Ms. Msuya served for several years as the inaugural World Bank Special Representative and head of the World Bank Group Office in the Republic of Korea. A microbiologist from Tanzania, Ms. Msuya began her career at the World Bank as a public health specialist for Africa in 1998. Turns out that SPPGA has a special connection worth noting, since Joyce was a postdoctoral fellow with the Lew Institute for Global Issues in the mid-1990s. So we have a long shared history. We really are happy to welcome her back to Vancouver virtually. We know it's evening where you are, Ms. Msuya, so we especially appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Welcome. I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alison McFarlane, for a very kind introduction. Let me start by expressing my deepest thanks to SPPGA, as well as the Department of Political Science, and my special thanks to Professor Tibai Jien for co-hosting this very special event for me to engage with the UBC community. Just like Alison, I would like to recognize Professor Boyd, whom I've just had a privilege of engaging, as well as Lindsay, and Samira, of course, for moderating this session. I have incredibly fond memories of my time at UBC. I am deeply proud to have been connected to the university. I must say, Alison was very kind to mention my connection with UBC. I will go further and say UBC actually molded and shaped my purpose for life. As a scientist working at the Lew Institute, then under the late Ivan Head, a world-renowned internationalist, Canadian, opened my eyes to what would be possible in terms of connecting the global challenges grounded on scientific foundations and to make a difference in this world. So I'm profoundly grateful to UBC for showing me the sense of purpose of my career. But also UBC is personal for me. A week ago, today, I was glued into the TV because my daughter, Melanie Mpanju, was graduating from UBC. My husband also has a PhD in virology from UBC. So just like UBC's motto dating back to 1915, a commitment from UBC to attract and support those who have the drive to shape a better world. I do want to note and appreciate UBC's influence in shaping not only my life, but my family's life as well. Now, going back to my talk, I'm very privileged to speak. This is the first talk I'm giving to a Canadian university. Never have I needed to call on the UBC experience more to express and exchange ideas with you all on this webinar. Can we cut emissions fast enough? How to respond to the climate crisis without damaging the future prosperity of developing countries. Now, let me start by noting the climate crisis is one of the most wicked challenges that humanity has ever faced. For a start, it intersects with a multitude of other complex problems, which means we cannot deal with it in isolation. Nor is it just a political or scientific issue. It is a psychological, economic, behavioral, cultural, spiritual, and moral problem too. There are also divergent views on what the climate problem actually is. And sadly, some parts of the society refuse to acknowledge that there is a problem at all. It is also global in scale, which means it requires an enormous degree of global cooperation. It is scientifically complex too. Information is sometimes incomplete, sometimes contradictory, and sometimes still evolving. and its most damaging impacts will happen in the future, which neither humans nor the systems we have designed are very good at planning for. And to top it all, the large system-level changes that need to be made to address the crisis are deeply divisive and require tremendous amounts of political will and leadership. So we have our work cut out for us. There is no simple solution. There is no silver bullet. To tackle the crisis, we will need an array of tools, and we will need people from all disciplines, all parts of society, all parts of the world to set their minds to the task before us. The scale of the challenge is daunting. To limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, annual emissions must be cut in half by 2030. Meeting this target will require nothing less than a system-level transformation of the world we have built, a change in the technological, economical, and social organization of society, a rethinking of worldviews, cultural norms, our values, and the way we govern ourselves, a fundamental transformation of our relationship with the living world. But how do we do this on a global scale and at the necessary speed? And how do we do this without damaging the future prosperity of people living in parts of the world that have been unable to enjoy the high levels of affluence we see in the West? Well, we can begin by acknowledging where the root of the problem lies. G20 countries account for 78% of all global emissions, and the world's wealthiest 1% produce double the combined carbon emissions of the poorest 50%. In other words, it's the world's richest nations that have contributed to the problem. So what can these wealthy nations do to cut emissions fast enough to keep the Paris target? There are some obvious first steps. For a start, they can cancel all coal projects. Public banks, as well as investors in commercial banks and pension funds, can also stop financing coal, both at home and abroad. And then they can go one better by shifting these investments into renewable energy. And the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, has spoken about this. Canada is a good example of what can be done. The country has cut its use of coal in half in the last 2 decades. It has promised to end all coal power by 2030. And its creation of the Power Past Coal Alliance is inspiring other countries to follow suit. But we also need to look at the bigger picture. The focus of our economies will need to change. We can no longer pursue economic growth at all costs. Instead, we need a new yardstick to measure social progress, with one that values nature, that sees the living world as the branch of the tree that we all sit on rather than something to be exploited. This will require governments and corporations to place nature at the very heart of decision-making. It means integrating the goals of carbon neutrality, a halt to land degradation, and the conservation of biodiversity into all economic and fiscal policies. To achieve this, we will need to restructure our economies so that they're circular and regenerative instead of linear and extractive. There are plenty of policy options that can speed up the transformation. Governments can put a price on carbon. They can phase out the subsidies. The US $5 trillion spent on subsidizing unsustainable sectors could be spent on designing new business models, alternative livelihoods, and nature-friendly solutions, on activities that restore the richness of the living world and advanced sustainable low carbon economies. If all this sounds daunting, then policymakers must be reminded that the transition to a net zero emissions, climate resilient world represents not a cost or a burden, but the greatest economic, business, and commercial opportunities of our time. And COVID presents an enormous opportunity to begin this transition. To seize this moment, governments must allocate far more of their response packages to building the brave new world that we know it is possible. There are promising signs that rich nations and the private sector are finally waking up to the need to act. Let me share some examples. Public support for green action is growing. As it does, more and more countries, corporations, and financial institutions are looking to align their activity with the goals of the Paris Agreement. The financial sector is starting to factor climate-related risk assessments into financing and portfolio decisions. The price of electricity generation from renewable sources, particularly solar, has decreased sharply. And advances in innovation and technology are starting to bear fruit. This is cause for hope. But while any further delay is dangerous, we also need to be honest with ourselves. There will be trade-offs in the short term. The fruits of the transition will be distributed unevenly, especially in low-income countries. Short-term job losses may be expected in carbon-heavy industries, for example, but also artificial intelligence and the fourth industrial revolution provide opportunities as part of the transition. To ensure the transition does not leave anyone behind, the nations that have benefited most from the era of fossil fuels have a moral duty to protect those that stand to lose the most from its end. That means investing heavily in social protections that safeguard the most marginalized. It is important to remember, though, that the cost of inaction is greater than the cost of action. And there is growing evidence that pro-poor policies not only address immediate socioeconomic concerns, but also lead to sustainable development. By some estimates, the shift to a low-carbon resilient economy could create more than 200 million net new jobs globally by 2030. To get a sense of how this might happen, let's look at investments in activities that restore natural habitats. Regenerating mangroves, for example, in Thailand, led to an increase in jobs and livelihoods of the people who depend on these vital ecosystems. At the same time, these nature restoration projects both mitigate climate change, carbon sinks, and help countries to adapt to its impact, such as storm surge and floods. In addition, we now know that during the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, some coastal communities were shielded from the waves' destruction by mangrove forests, which motivated efforts to protect and restore them. Another example is Costa Rica. In 1970, the country counted with a forest cover of 75% across its land. Through increasing demand for commercial agriculture, by 1987, forest cover had reduced to an alarming 21%, with projections that within 2 decades, all primary forest would be lost. Costa Rica was not the only country heading in this direction. Between 2000 and 2010, 70% of deforestation occurred in Latin America as a consequence of intensive commercial agriculture expansion. I highlight the case of Costa Rica because in 1986, the government took an action that dramatically changed the development trajectory of the country. It introduced innovative legislation that recognized and incentivized forest restoration, targeting small-scale farmers, and developed over the years a world-renowned system of payment for ecosystem services that offered financial compensation for the maintenance and restoration of forest in the country. Consequently, by 1997, the country had gained back 42% of its forest, and by 2010, it was 52%. Today, Costa Rica is one of the countries that hosts the biggest sustainable tourism in all Latin America, offering stable and secure jobs to its population and ensuring the protection of nature as a source of livelihoods. Nature-based solutions like this are a massive win-win for people and planet. So ultimately, the choice is not development or the climate crisis. The two are so deeply interconnected that the choice is really about whether we want to address both or neither. When we think about it in this way, there really is no trade-off between cutting emissions and development. Our economies, our resilience, our progress emerges out of and relies on the living world. The two are so inextricably linked that our chances of ensuring long-term, inclusive, and resilient development depends fundamentally on the health of our planet. Simply put, sustainable development is impossible unless we address the climate and nature crisis. At this point, you may be thinking, but what can I do? What role can students and academic institutions play in the transition? The answer is, it's a lot. The scale of the crisis is so great that it throws up questions for almost every single academic discipline. It's political and economic, it's cultural, it's a public health issue, it's a behavioral science issue. It poses profound spiritual and philosophical questions, questions of ethics and law, art and literature too, in their power to transform values. And there is obviously the science itself that is always being refined and upgraded, shedding new light on the levers and leverage points of transformation. Academic institutions have a big role to play in sounding the alarm, raising awareness of the planetary crisis, and educating people about the solutions available to us. Talks, editorials, social media are the megaphones. We must use every tool in the box to ensure our leaders fulfill their responsibilities and promises. Students around the world are already reshaping the public's view of the climate crisis. The global school strikes and other youth-led social movements are putting increasing pressure on politicians and business leaders to act. And we are seeing the impact in the courts, in the boardrooms of fossil fuel companies, in the investment portfolios of universities, in the products offered by companies, and in the increasingly ambitious emissions targets set by political leaders. It is essential that students and young people maintain this pressure. So, if there are 3 bits of advice I have for you, then they are these. First, take risks, push boundaries, and ask the questions that no one dares ask. Transformation cannot happen if we lack the courage to explore, to push beyond the limits of what we think is possible. So keep pushing, keep experimenting. Second, lead with your heart, but ground your battles in science. The challenges ahead of us, may seem overwhelming, but the key is not to numb ourselves to the problems or give in to feelings of helplessness. Remember that the pain we may feel stems from a deep love for our planet and its people. Hold on to this love and then wrap this passion in the power of science and the wisdom of our elders to bring about the changes we urgently so need. Lastly, arm yourselves with knowledge. When we educate ourselves, we can convince friends, families, and peers to act. When we educate ourselves, we can also transform the education system itself to ensure that young people are taught the skills that prepare them for the uncertain future that lies ahead. And make no mistake, we are heading into a period of deep uncertainty. This week, the world marked another grim milestone. The level of carbon dioxide is now higher than at any time in the last 4 million years, a time when sea levels were 78 feet higher than today. We are living the Holocene, a moment of climatic stability that has allowed human civilization to flourish for 10,000 years. As we enter the Anthropocene, a period of climatic instability, we will find that many of the maps we once had no longer serve as dependable guides. Thankfully, there are many brilliant minds working at creating new maps. But like this university, UBC's motto says, this moment is also yours. This precious planet is your inheritance. This is your decade. And while the maps we are creating are yours to use, they are also yours to draw. Without your input, they will fail. So let us seize this moment and together turn this crisis into a future that puts the living world and human well-being at the heart of every single thing we do. Our future depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that great talk. So we will open the floor now to some questions that I've already had in the chat. So just to begin, we have Ramana, who has asked from the audience that you mentioned earlier that Canada has reduced its coal emissions by 50%. By half. However, the country's total greenhouse gas emissions have increased from 600 megatons to 730 since 1990. And there hasn't been much reduction since the Paris Climate Act agreement. Do you have any comments on this larger picture, and what should Canada be doing concretely?
Thank you very much. I didn't catch the name of the person who asked the question. Sorry?
It was Ramana.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Ramina. So one is, I hear what you're saying. We in the United Nations Environment Program, we have always said, and in my talk, I have also emphasized, the speed of action does not capture the urgency of the crisis. Now, specifically to Canada, but not just Canada, I would actually like to comment more on the global picture, including Canada. The transitions from fossil fuels to renewable energy does take time. We also know there are fiscal and economic implications of the transition. What we have seen at the global level is Canada's leadership in actually pushing forward with the Paris Agreement commitments. Now, if the question is it enough? The answer is no. Is Canada in the right direction relative to other countries? The answer is yes. So in terms of concrete suggestions, I think it's fair to say that the current government of Prime Minister Trudeau has actually laid out the path towards 2030. And there also, the government is engaging at the global forum. For example, now they are quite active with the upcoming COP26 in Glasgow. So we are anxiously waiting to see what types of actions and financing packages Canada and other governments will actually come up with in Glasgow later this year. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. Our next attendee is asking, solar and wind power have significant land use implications from both the generating capacity and new transmission lines. However, local communities are often opposed to land use changes, which delays their development, often by decades. How do we overcome this problem?
It would be interesting to know the specific, because what we are saying, you may know that UNEP is headquartered in Nairobi, and most of Africa, for example, has quite a lot of solar energy potential. I have also traveled to countries like India, including in the deserts, where because of technology, their whole renewable energy solutions, there are quite a number of options. So depending on the context, and I'm not sure I understand the context of that question when it comes to land degradation, I would argue actually the cost of, generally speaking, the cost of installing solar energy in most places, including in low-income countries, is way lower compared to, for example, the impact of fossil fuels or alternatives to non-renewable energy. So it will be interesting to hear more about the context of particular land. Every country is very different, and I recognize that the question may come from a very different context from where we have data on.
And so for, we have another question from our attendee. The climate crisis now gets a great deal of attention today for all the reasons that you've mentioned. The biodiversity crisis seems less visible at the international political level. What could raise the profile for decision makers of addressing this global issue?
It's a very good question. So in UNEP, we actually see climate crisis and the biodiversity loss as the two sides of the same coin. Now, in terms of the attention of climate crisis compared to the biodiversity loss, there is validity to the question. It is fair to say the Paris moment highlighted and elevated the data, political momentum around climate crisis. But let's look at 2021 alone. This year, for example, the two big COPs that are scheduled to happen. One is on the COP on biodiversity, because the Aichi targets, which were put in place by the global community to measure the progress in biodiversity, have expired, and now there is an expectation of a new framework for the post-2020 biodiversity framework. And the anticipation, subject to what happens and what the parties of the Biodiversity Convention decide, we may see a Paris moment for biodiversity loss. And similarly, later this year, there is the COP26 on climate change in Glasgow. So again, you will see the two sides of the same coin coming up. But I would also want to add the biodiversity agenda is prominent in places like Africa, where biodiversity does have a significant contribution to economic activities. If you look at Kenya, for example, I think it's about 40% of the GDP comes from tourism-related activities, and therefore the whole natural world is absolutely central to economic activities. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have another question from an anonymous attendee, and it says, "Thank you for your words of wisdom. I was wondering how we will continue to hold richer countries accountable to meeting 2030 targets, and how we will ensure that rich countries help and support lower income countries in the economic, social, and cultural spheres." And I think this is a more important issue for myself personally, I think, is as we've seen with COVID-19, rich countries have dismissed lower income countries' needs and only focused on themselves. How do we make sure that this is not the case moving forward in addressing climate change?
So, I mean, thank you for the anonymous question. I mean, one, I would say you're asking someone who is an eternally optimist. Yeah. So I tend to look at a glass half full than a glass half empty. I think it's very important to look at now compared to 20 years ago. Yeah. With regards to the rich countries, if some of you have followed the recent G7 meetings that took place in London, and their communique, they actually did refer to climate change. If you look at Biden-Harris administration in the US, climate change is at the core of Biden-Harris administration, and many other countries, including Canada, the European Union, etc. And we're working very closely with these countries. So I believe, as I have said, if you look at the youth movement, both in developed and developing countries, there is an increasing accountability because youth are also voters, and they speak at their booth. And politicians, just like in all parts of the world, they will listen to the voters. So how do you hold accountable? I would break it down to domestic. How are the Canadians, for example, holding the Canadian politicians accountable based on the pledges that they have said? But also I have trust in the multilateralism. What I see within the United Nations is the wealthiest nations coming and investing in organizations like the United Nations, particularly on issues of climate, environment, and development. And that gives me hope. I also see significant partnerships between developed and developing countries. Take a G20 and other forum, take the United Nations. So that, again, for me, gives me hope. I also see a lot of bilateral engagement around climate and environmental issues. And if I look at some of the overseas development assistance allocation that goes into climate and environmental matters, it's significant, and it has increased over the last few years. That, again, gives me hope. But at the end of the day, as the saying goes, all politics are local. So citizens have the power through their voices, through the booth, and through innovation and ideas to actually catalyze change. Over to you.
Well, Assistant Secretary General, you give me hope. So our next question is from George. In your remarks, you emphasize the importance of education and use of the media to help bring about change. What do you think the role of political organizing and activism plays in pushing governments to act more meaningfully?
Sorry, I missed the last bit of the question.
What do you think the role of political organizing and activism plays in pushing governments to act more meaningfully?
Oh, I believe there is immense power. I mean, look at the Gretas of this world, and there are many. Some are very local. We work with indigenous communities. And just by forming coalitions and having collective voices and sending letters to legislators, you do see actually movements. If you look at the fiscal accountability of a number of budgets, including in developed countries, how taxpayers are holding policymakers and politicians accountable, absolutely. I think the social media and technology more broadly has really transformed. Decision makers know that For example, young people can record if there are some unsustainable practices that are happening, and the photos, the videos may go viral. So I think in terms of accountability, clearly the world has changed way more compared even to 10, 15 years ago. So I do believe in it. And that's why I thought if young people, but also taxpayers, voters, equip themselves with knowledge, with education, with science as part of advocacy, that definitely will make a difference. In United Nations Environment Program, we do host something called United Nations Environment Assembly once every 2 years, where ministers of environment from all over the world meet to set the direction of the global environment agenda. As part of those meetings, we have stakeholders, indigenous communities, women, children's groups, civil society actually represented, and their voices be heard as key stakeholders of the assembly. And that again brings a different dimension in terms of accountability. Thanks.
And we have a question from our panelist and professor. And he's asking, thanks for the wonderful and uplifting and motivating talk, Joyce. It is important to hear this. We're at a critical or a crucial historic moment in 2021, coming out of the COVID crisis and heading to both COP15 on biodiversity and COP26 on climate in the same year, but also caught in a new Cold War dynamics. Do you see great momentum already building towards the two COPs? And he's saying, I just signed the petition for 30% by 2030. Are we seeing a good competitive dynamics growing that may deliver this goal at the COP?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. And I would also add, in addition to the two COPs, the professor has referred to, one on biodiversity, the other one on climate change. There is also the post-2020 framework on chemicals, which also is very important if you think about the three planetary crises: climate, nature loss, and pollution, chemicals. Do I see the momentum? Yes. We have been engaging with and supporting, for example, the UK as part of the preparation for the COP on climate in Glasgow. As part of the bigger UN system, we are also working with our sister organization UNFCCC very, very closely on preparation for the COP in Glasgow. As you may know, Professor, the CBD Convention on Biodiversity, which is located in Montreal, is actually administratively mapped to UNEP. So we are engaging right now. They are having, the parties are having meetings, virtual meetings, to set out and negotiate on the new framework. So we are optimistic as well. So overall, yes, in terms of the politics, I think you have also seen the leadership from the big countries, including the US, and the renewed focus on climate and Paris. So again, with that, our Secretary General has been engaging with Kerry, Ambassador Kerry, as well as Biden and Harris administration on climate. So yes, I am again optimistic 2021, but I'm also very realistic because a number of countries are still recovering from COVID, and still in many ways COVID pandemic is a humanitarian issue. So it's too early to say, for example, on the fiscal implications of the pandemic, what the numbers will be and what the impact may be in terms of actually translating commitments into actions.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Punya, and they would like to know, how do you see artificial intelligence transforming the future in the context of climate change?
It's a very good question. I mean, I see, look, I'm not an IT specialist, but I can tell you what I have seen through my travels pre-COVID. If you look at a number of Asian countries also, let's say countries that depend on the agriculture sector as a core part of the economy, water scarcity and drought is a big problem because of the shifts in climate prediction and projections. What I have seen, for example, is the power of artificial intelligence to monitor and help small farmers to predict what the weather patterns will be. In some of these communities, they just used to wait to see whether there's clouds or sun, or remembering that March is a rainy period, etc. So the artificial intelligence, in many ways, is empowering planning, if you like, when it comes to the agriculture sector. Also, I have seen drones used to actually monitor inputs, fertilizer inputs, because part of the problem in the agriculture sector is the pesticides and the chemicals impact when it comes to climate and pollution. So again, there the use of drones in both irrigation but also monitoring fertilizer inputs are one. Now, what will come later is to be seen. We are, for example, within UNEP exploring video games, for example, as part of educating young people, but also reaching mass populations when it comes to environmental education, but focusing on climate change, nature loss, as well as chemicals and pollution. So I think there are enormous opportunities, and the young generation are quite creative and innovative. So I look forward to seeing even more innovations coming out.
Thank you. I have another question. How does the UN separate its internal power dynamics from its role in pushing fair and ecologically just climate change mitigation strategies between developing and developed countries, given the disproportionate historic emissions by rich countries?
It's a good question. You know, the United Nations is a membership organization. We have about 196 members. And as out of that 196 members, you have developed countries and developing countries. I refer to United Nations Environment Assembly. Every country is represented, from Fiji to the United States to China to Canada. So every country is a member of the United Nations. We don't get into sovereign political issues. What we do in the case of UNEP are 3-4 things. One is advocating for environmental dimensions, for example, of sustainable development goals, but also as the top global environmental authority, we set the directions through UNEA, United Nations Environment Assembly, for the world. 2, we produce science. We have quite a number of publications, the Global Environment Outlook, the Emissions Gap Report, to help policymakers to actually make the kinds of choices informed by science in their domestic state, but also regional as well as global. 3rd, we convene. The power of United Nations is bringing all the voices, regardless of the income, to the table and actually have substantive conversations on environmental issues. And lastly, partnerships. UNEP, for example, is very, very small compared to the scale of the challenge. So we partner with other UN entities, but also other multilateral organizations. So in summary, I think the beauty of multilateralism is that every voice counts. And that's what usually moves the agenda. Paris Agreement is one example of that.
Thank you. And we have a question from Ambassador Michael Small. What are the prospects for resuming face-to-face negotiations by COP26? I understand there is some uncertainty around this at present.
Well, obviously, the host of COP26 is the UK, so I cannot speak for the UK government. But I think it's fair to say it's hard to tell. I wish I could tell you it will happen or will not happen, but I don't know. I mean, we are seeing the vaccination progress varies from one country to another. I'm in Kenya. There are still, movements into second jabs. Others are still getting first jabs. So I would say it's hard to tell. I mean, that's a short answer to your question. We did have, for example, the United Nations Environment Assembly, and the member states decided not to have any negotiations in the meeting in February, and it was mostly an administrative virtual meeting. We are supposed to have the second part of UNEP in February 2022. We are hoping it will be face-to-face, but I cannot tell you if it will be.
And we have another question. What role do you think organizations such as the World Trade Organization can play in helping address climate change?
Well, so I can't speak for WTO, but we have a program on trade and environment. For example, if you look at the issue of agriculture trade, including, for example, fertilizers, there is an element that touches on environment, because if countries and farmers are not using sustainable products, then we are actually contributing to a problem. So there we're working with WTO to actually see how can we develop more greening capacity of the trade supply chains. There is also the issue of sustainable consumption and production. If you look at most of this planetary crisis, the basic premise is unsustainable consumption and production. Production has links with WTO. So there again, we're looking at on circular economy, are there opportunities for recycling, reusing, rather than use and discard type of things when it comes to production. Also in other areas, for example, in the mining sector, in terms of standards that may actually help the environment, the environmental dimensions. We are, again, working with broader partners, including WTO.
Thank you. So I have a question from Eddie. How do we think about China as a key player in the global environment in addressing climate change? What may be some challenges when considering the intensifying competition between China and US? Could this competition help the goal when thinking of technology, or create barriers when we think about geopolitical and territorial issues?
Okay, so one is I'm not going to comment on the geopolitics between China and the US. I think there are other people who are well better positioned to speak to that compared to me. I'll stay in my environment lane. And in that lane, I would say China being the second largest economy in the world, high number of population, absolutely, it's central. The issue of climate change, if you read our emissions gap report, China is up there. The story of fossil fuels, China is up there. So equally, just like we're talking about all big economies, US, China, are absolutely central when it comes to environmental issues. So we do have an office in Beijing. And one of our programs that has been around for a while in China is around air pollution, both on technical capacity, but also working with different cities to try and address the source and the drivers, both from land-based pollution to sea or oceans. Yeah.
And we will take the last question. How do you make the decision to transition from such a specific, one of the panelists, your passion as they're also a microbiology, a graduate, and they admire your passion and sustainability efforts. How do you make the decision to transition from such a specific science into a more humanistic one in conversation and sustainability? What did you do to move forward to study sustainability and advocacy?
So that's a very good question. I'm happy to even have a bigger conversation with UBC community. So, I mean, I would characterize my unconventional journey, and I was talking to Alison prior to this meeting, in 3 phases. I think one is because I was molded by my upbringing, my parents, who believed strongly in the power of science and strong analytical education. I studied science because I really thought I wanted to be a medical doctor. But then I was fascinated by how diseases and viruses cause diseases. So I ended up working in the lab and publishing and studying viruses. I graduated from University of Ottawa, actually. But then when I moved to Vancouver, UBC in particular, something happened. And what that something was immediately I realized the power of scientific analytical foundations in actually solving people's problems and global problems. So that's, and the Liu Institute then under the late Ivan Head allowed me to interconnect. So I'm very inspired by interdisciplinary nature of universities that I see now, which was not there when I went to school. So one was the link between public health policy, and we did a research, which I will not bore with, at Liu Institute to actually look at the transmission of communicable diseases through travel. And from Liu Institute, then I was hired by the World Bank Group. So I moved from Vancouver to Washington, D.C. in early 1998. And there I started working on community-driven projects, traveling to different parts of the world and really seeing development challenges. But again, building on my UBC to interconnect environment, health, urbanization, etc. So after 20 years of wonderful career at the World Bank Group, public sector, working with governments, but also private sector with companies, I was looking for a Joyce 2.0 after I turned 50. You know, what legacy do I want to leave? And 3-4 years ago, there was no better calling than environment and sustainability, but not in the narrow sense, with interconnectedness of the purpose, spirit, and foundation that I got from UBC. So that's where I am. If I were to share my lesson, one is take risk. No risk, no reward. That's what I have learned after living in different parts of the world, including China and South Korea. 2, I would say do things that make you uncomfortable. I don't do things that are easy. And I tell my kids not to do things that are plain vanilla, because that's when you grow and you build a different type of muscle. And then 3, be curious about people and cultures and things that are very different from you. I was the first African woman to be based in the World Bank office in China. I was the first of everything for the World Bank in South Korea. Was it easy? No. Was it rewarding? Absolutely. So that's how you chart your own path. So long answer to a short question.
An incredible answer too. So that is all the time we have. But before we end, I would like to bring in Melanie to make her ending remarks. Thank you for everything.
Yeah, thank you, Samira. And in just wrapping up, I'd like to thank Samira again, and of course, my mother for an amazing event. Thank you as well to all of the organizers and attendees who made this event happen. This has been something that has been in the works for a couple of months now, and I'm so happy that it was able to manifest into a successful event that we could share with the wider UBC community. And although this event has now come to a close, I hope that the knowledge and information that we've all learned today will stay with you all as you move forward in your respective lives and careers. And I hope that we all not only remember the disproportionate effects of the climate on developing countries, the global South, and racialized communities worldwide, but we also work to actively center and uplift these voices. And here in Canada especially, I think it is important to acknowledge the crucial role of Indigenous communities in environmental scholarship. And this is just simply one way that we can ensure that the future prosperity of vulnerable groups is not exacerbated any further, as we discussed in detail today. And yeah, finally to my mother, Miss Joyce Msuya, thank you so much for joining us today. I think I can speak for all of us when I say it has truly been a pleasure to have you. And as your daughter, I'm constantly amazed at all of your insightful knowledge. And I'm so happy that I got the opportunity to share you with all of my fellow peers and professors today. And as an African woman, especially, you've been such an inspiration for young Black women and women of color entering leadership roles. So again, I thank you for being an incredible role model and advocate for international development and sustainability. And yeah, that is all for our panel today. And I hope you all enjoyed this event as much as I did. And as we are still living in a global pandemic, I hope that you all continue to stay safe and healthy and have a great rest of your day, wherever you may be. Thank you.